For our time in God's Word today, we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and a little bit of chapter 8. I believe that it is a gracious providence of God that we are in this portion of His Word, because we are a church family trying to process grief. It was just a week ago that we lost our dear brother, a true servant of the Lord and a leader in our church for so long. And while we are rejoicing for him that he has been with Jesus in glory for a week now, we are grieving for his family, and we're grieving our loss as a church family. Well, it's rather ironic and a gracious providence from God that we're in this portion of his word, because the first thing that comes out of the mouth of the preacher in chapter 7 is to tell us that it's actually better for our lives and the way that we will live to be in the house of mourning rather than the house of mirth and merrymaking. And we know which house our hearts gravitate to and which we would rather have, but we are in, right now, the house of mourning, metaphorically speaking, trying to process our grief. And so I believe that Solomon's reflections in chapter 7 in particular will really be a blessing to us if we'll take these things to heart. Now, remember, first of all, what Solomon calls, with that code poetic phrase he uses, what he calls this present evil age that is marked by sin and suffering and death. He calls it over and over again, the world under the sun. And he says, life in the world under the sun is all vanity. Nothing that belongs to this age is permanent. All beauty fades, all joy dwindles, and all pleasure passes. We can no more be filled to the full with the beauty and the joy and the pleasure of this age than they can last. We can no more hang on to them than we can tie down a puff of smoke. It's chasing the wind. And yet still, even though we are struggling and grieving in this age and in this time of our lives, we still long for a good life. And often we wonder, can one be found? What would it look like if we could find it? So Ecclesiastes 7 and 8 can help us. The passage begins with a jarring proverb. Solomon says, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth." Now, that's a proverb that's going to leave us scratching our heads, because we're going to wonder very skeptically, how can the day of death be better than the day of birth? How can that possibly be? Well, what Solomon intends to show us is that the day of death makes for a much better teacher in life than the day of birth. And what he writes in the subsequent verses shows us that. So let's read on. He says in verse 2, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth." So the preacher tells us that attending the house of mourning and observing the end of life is in fact good for us. This is an incredible change of perspective from what he was conveying to us in chapters 1 and 2. If you remember back there, Solomon was still telling us about how he went through this process of searching the world over for the good life, for that permanent life, permanent joy and permanent peace. But remember, something kept getting in the way. It was death. Death haunted him. Death was the incontrovertible fact that haunted him at every turn in his quest for permanence. It was always there. And it led him to distress. He said in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, "How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. Nothing lasts because of death. Well, what a change in perspective now. Because the death that haunted him, so that he hated life, became the death that taught him how to live life and even to enjoy life. Incredibly, surprisingly, there is much instruction for life in death. And we need to be taught, and we need to take it to heart, that nothing in this age is permanent. Nothing that belongs to the world under the sun lasts. Everything has an expiry date. Everything is fleeting. Now we're going to go on from verse 4, and we're going to look at a series of proverbs, of reflections by Solomon. And I think the first 4 verses will guide our understanding to the verses that follow. So what he has laid down very plainly is that everything is fleeting. And if nothing is permanent and everything is fleeting, then nothing can be everything to us. Nothing that belongs to the world under the sun can be our ultimate, our be-all and our end-all. So we're going to look at a series of fleeting, passing away things that can't control our hearts, that ought not to be the source of our hope and our joy. Well, what's the first thing to note? The first impermanent thing, we'll go back to the first 4 verses, is ourselves. If our lives are a vapor, a puff of smoke carried off in the wind, then we ought not to put too much stock into us. How foolish it would be for our lives to revolve around me, myself, and I, if me, myself, and I are passing away. The world is going to tell us, follow your heart and believe in yourself. And we know that there's some truth in some situations to that. We can kind of get a gist of what they're saying, but those are half-truths, really half-truths that become lies. We can't follow that ultimately. You can't follow your heart to the end. You can't save yourself. Should you be the Lord of yourself? We can't be our own authority. We ought not to believe in ourselves. We cannot be our own ultimate thing because we're going to die one day. Now, if your life, the whole of your life is impermanent, a vapor, what about the moments, the singular moments of your life? How much more fleeting are the moments of your life? Very often, we let moments and circumstances control us, how we feel, how we think. We let moments entice us and moments drive us bonkers. We let moments determine our joy, determine whether we are hopeful or angry or what have you. And if they are more fleeting even than our lives, and our lives can't be the ultimate, then certainly the moments shouldn't be either. There's so many moments that we ought not to take to heart. So we'll look at a few more things from the next verses that are even more fleeting than what we are. Number 1, don't take to heart the song of fools, especially when they're singing your praise. Solomon says in verses 5 and 6, "It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity." The song of fools is like the crackling of thorns under a pot, kindling for a fire. He speaks of thorns. I think of, a fire on the beach and getting a dried up cedar branch and throwing it into the fire. Quickly, it fuels the fire. The fire bursts upward, makes a lot of noise, but it burns up fast. That's the song of fools who would sing our praise. Don't put stock into what the good things that they may say about you when it's truly foolish. What pleases them ought not to please us. And what pleases them really doesn't matter. So their song might make a lot of noise, but burns up quickly. It's fleeting. The second thing is power and money. We see this in verse 7. Surely oppressions drive the wise into madness, or surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. This is power misused, that's oppression, and money misused, that's a bribe. Power and money acquired that we put too much hope in will be abused and will corrupt us before the day of our corruption, the day of our death. Power and money and fame are fleeting things. Don't put too much stock into them. I was watching, just for historical interest's sake, I was watching on this video the opening of an Oscars night from the mid-1960s. And all of the celebrities were walking the red carpet, which was, of course, dulled because it was in black and white. And I could hear all of the screams of these fans in the background shouting and so excited because they saw, their favorite celebrity. Well, the funny thing was, I didn't know who a single person that was walking the red carpet was. I didn't recognize their faces. I didn't even recognize their names. And I'm not, completely ignorant about that age in Hollywood and so on. The only face that I recognized when the camera scanned the crowd at one point was the name Walter Matthau, a very memorable face. But honestly, we can't even remember who these people were anymore. And we really don't care to remember. What does their fame and their money and all of that celebrity amount to? It amounts to nothing. Don't let power and money go to your head. How foolish would that be when it's such a fleeting thing? The third thing, a third puff of smoke not to take to heart, is worldly success, especially the sudden kind, the kind that gets off to a quick start. Solomon says in verse 8, better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit than the proud in spirit. So let's say that a venture of yours just rockets out of the gates. You have that quick initial success. Well, will it last? The proud in spirit counts on it lasting and boasts. The patient in spirit says, let's wait and see. Let's not count our chickens before they hatch. We can't count this as a true lasting success. And as far as success goes, all worldly success is fleeting. Don't put too much stock into it, but especially that initial quick kind. So don't put too much stock into anything sudden, whether a sudden success, like a venture that's quick out of the gate, or a sudden disappointment. Don't take it too much to heart. The next verse says, be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. We're talking about moments that are fleeting. I know that there are some disappointments in this life that have long-range consequences, wounds that can last the rest of our lives. But of course, the vast majority of disappointing moments are over just like that and have consequences that don't last beyond an hour. But very often, the anger from the disappointment stays. Long after the moment has gone, long after the consequences have disappeared, we still have the anger. Solomon says, anger lodges in the heart of fools. Death is a reality check for us. Has a lot to say about how angry we get in this life. Death teaches us to keep our expectations in check. Because if life itself will let us down in the end, because it will fail, then it only follows that there will be many letdowns along the way. That should be our expectation in an age that is fleeting and failing, and everything that belongs to it is fleeting and failing. My dad used to say to me all the time when I was a kid, don't get your hopes up, son. And I don't know if my brother and sister heard that as much as I do, but I think that he could see how excited I was at the possibility of something and just didn't want to see me disappointed. And, it drove me nuts when he said that, but it was wise because he didn't want me investing my passions too much into anything that is going to pass away. Every hope in this world that belongs to this age, the world under the sun, will fail us. Everyone around you is fleeting and failing. So don't be surprised when fleeting, failing people disappoint you. Don't be surprised when they cross you, when their best is not good enough, when they can't keep their word, when they cut you off in traffic, or when they mess up your order. It is inevitable that the fleeting and failing people around us will disappoint us, as we will disappoint them. So we ought to keep our expectations and therefore our anger in check. So don't put too much stock in the praise of men, the song of fools, or money or power, or quick success or sudden disappointments. None of these moments last. Don't put hope and don't invest passion in the wrong places. By not putting too much stock into these things, you will help your self-control. Now, here's one more thing. Don't put too much stock into the past. If our lives and the moments of our lives are fleeting, if they have an expiry date, then we can't put too much stock into them. Much as we may sometimes wish we could, we cannot go backward. And so what we have in verse 10 is a warning against being overly nostalgic. The preacher says, "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." I have to admit to being a very nostalgic person. And I've been aware, this verse has kind of been at the forefront of my thinking, or close to it anyway, for quite a while. But the first memory that I thought of when I considered this verse this week, was warm summer evenings from my childhood when my sister and my brother and I would get 25 cents from my parents. And after supper on that warm summer evening, we would walk down Willow Avenue and then up Wilson to the corner of Wilson and Woodward, where there was a Becker's convenience store. And we would go in, and with our 25 cents, we would buy either a chocolate flavored or banana flavored popsicle. And we loved those. And so we'd get them, and then we'd walk home and try to eat them before they melted all over the sidewalk. And you think back to times like that, you probably are recalling right now those moments from your life. We think back to those times, and those are the good old days, the simpler times, when you were a kid, when being a kid was all that there was, and it felt like being a kid was all that there would ever be. Nostalgia can be a very dangerous thing if it controls us, and if our hopes and our joy is behind us in the past. The truth is, whenever we long for the good old days, we fail to remember what was aggravating to us at the time, whatever frustrations or worries there were on the side. Not only that, but when nostalgia controls us, we fail to enjoy the good gifts that God gives us today. One day, if we don't die suddenly, one day our health is going to be frail. And we'll be looking back at our lives, and nearly everything will seem like the good old days. And we might say, yeah, but what about a pandemic? Surely we won't look back to a pandemic as the good old days. But whenever we think about the good old days, like I said before, we ignore whatever was going on around us, and we think of the moment. The sunny day with our friends or with our family, and the good food that we enjoyed and the memories that we made. We know that those things are happening all the time, even during pandemic life. The truth is that God rains down blessings on his creation constantly. We have the evidence of his benevolent heart all around us. So in chapter 8, verse 15, Solomon says, "And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun." This is, I don't know how many times that he has said this now through Ecclesiastes, but it's a bunch. I'm sure this is, sounds like an echo to you. I think that Solomon, when he speaks of eating and drinking, this is just his summary way of speaking of the momentary pleasures of life. Eating and drinking goes along with, beautiful weather and having fun and enjoying family and friends and just that fellowship together. There is so much of that. It's constant. Let's not lose sight of it. If we're overly nostalgic for the past, we'll ignore God's blessings to us now. We won't enjoy what's right in front of us with those who are right beside us. In chapter 8, after the preacher has contemplated man's power over his neighbor to do him hurt, he says this, and we're looking at these verses because we're speaking of death and the finality of life. He says, "Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God." The answer to the brevity of life is not to squeeze as much pleasure out of it as you possibly can by any means that you possibly can. Living that way, you will end up on the wrong side of God. Rather, it will be well with those who fear him, who entrust their lives to their Creator and their deaths to the Creator and live their lives unto God. Now, we have this in our hearts, we have this natural discontent. We're always longing for better, and we long for the permanent life, permanent joy and peace. Well, I believe that this native discontent can actually help us yet. There is no permanent gain in the world under the sun, but there is a deliverer, there is a Savior, there is a Lord over all, who entered into the world under the sun and took on our human life, our human flesh, and acted as the light of the world. And he gained for us by his life and his death and his resurrection what we cannot gain but long for ourselves. He came down into our suffering, and he suffered all of the temptations and the disappointments without any of our sinful passions. He took the guilt of our sinful passions on himself, and he died the death that we deserve. He defeated death by his resurrection, and he has gone into glory again ahead of us, making a place for us, guaranteeing our place with him, and promising that he will come back. He urges us now to look to him and to the joy that is set before us. And the Lord Jesus Christ promises all his disappointed people. He promises the suffering and the grieving and the dying that he is. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? Here is your hope. Here is your joy. He is your hope and your joy and your life and your peace. He is the one who is permanent, who is forever, whose heart, whose love never fail, who gains for us and gives to us what we cannot gain for ourselves. Do we long for a good life? Let's come running to Jesus. May your soul cling to him. For everyone whose hope in life and death is Jesus Christ, it will be life and not death to die. This is our hope and our joy. May the Lord bless you.